going to be talking about cookies and web storage. We're going to start out with some browser objects that we've dealt with a little bit, but we haven't talked about them formally. So first of all, we are going to talk about the location object. And to do that, let's take a look at a URL and make sure we understand URLs. So this is a full URL with search parameters. So up here we have HTTP, that's our protocol. We have a host name, www.murex.com or murex.com. I'm not sure how to pronounce that name actually. We have a port number. After the colon, this is a port number. So that says access the web server at this address on port 8181. We have the word, the directory path. We have JavaScript. We have the name of a file, location.html. And then we have some search parameters here. So after the question mark, we're looking for the first name that's equal to G and last name that's equal to Hopper. And then we have a hash here with a result. So if you have a hashtag in a URL, it's going to load that page and it's going to try and scroll the page down to the ID of result in this case. So let's look at the location object. The location object has a bunch of properties we can use to deal with these things. So we can access all the different parts of this URL using the location object's properties. So href is a property that will give us the complete URL. There's a protocol property, which will tell us what protocol we're using. A host name property that will give us the host name. Actually, it's the host name and the domain name. There's a port property that will give us the port that we're on. There's a host property. So host is similar to host name. Don't confuse them. But the host property gives us both the host name and the port as one string. Okay. We have a path property that will give us the path, meaning the directory and the file that we're looking for. We have a search property, which will automatically pull out the search terms part of the address. And we have a hash property that will show us what hash was included in the address. The location object of the browser also has methods that we can use. So there's a reload method with an optional force parameter. And that causes the current page to reload. So if we tell the location to reload, we can reload the current web page, and we'll see examples of that in a second. And then the replace method lets us load a new page in the browser, but it replaces the current page in the history list. And we're going to see an example of that coming up. So let's look at some examples before we go over to some code in a actual editor in a browser. Location. If we want to load a new web page, we can say location.href and we can specify the location we want to load, so we can automatically cause a new page to load from this website. We can also do that without using the .href. So if we just use the location object itself, it's kind of a shortcut that will also load the new web page. So these are really equivalent statements here. They both do the exact same thing. We said there's a reload, so we can call location reload from our JavaScript, and it will reload the current page, but it's important to understand that reload like this loads the current page from the cache. So when you download a web page onto your computer, it caches it. And if you reload the same web page within a certain period of time, a short period of time, it's just going to pull it from the cache. And the reason web browsers do that is to make things faster. If I don't have to download it over the internet or do an HTTP request over the network, I can reload the page much quicker. So by default, if we just call location.reload, it's going to reload the page from the cache. But if we want to make sure to get a fresh copy from the server, inside the parentheses for location.reload, we have to specify true, and that will force the page to reload from the server rather than pulling it from cache. That would be the same thing if you're using Google Chrome. If you hold the control button when you hit a refresh, when you click on the refresh button of your web page, that forces a reload from the server as well. So that's basically the command that runs when you hit Control and click refresh of the browser. If you didn't know that, that's a neat trick sometime if you want to try it, to make sure you get a fresh copy of a web page from the server rather than a cached copy. And then this one is when we're going to see some example of a small application using this. Location.replace, and then we can specify a new page to load, but when we load that page, it's also going to replace the current history. Basically, kind of overriding so we don't have our history growing using the history object. Before we talk about all these, let's go look at the example that uses this. So here's a web page, and we're going to look at the code for this web page in a second. It says, welcome to our site. If you're an old hand here, just click enter and go on in. If you haven't been here, go through our tutorial. Okay, so if I click enter, it takes me to this picture of cute kittens. This is our website. So this is for people who have already been here. They're skipping the tutorial. But if I click the tutorial button, it takes me to the tutorial, which maybe explains how to use our site. Here's the first thing you need to know about our site. And then there's a next button. Okay. And then here's the second thing you know about our site. And here's the next button. It takes me to the page 3. Now, one thing you need to understand about this is when I come up here and I click back, if I click back to see the history, notice I don't see a bunch of things in the history. And if I click the button, it just takes me back to that first landing page. If I click the tutorial and go all the way to the end and finish the tutorial, I still get the kittens. When I click the back button, I don't go back through all the tutorial pages. So let's look at the code to make that happen. And it works on this location.replace loading and replacing the page in history. So let's take a look at the code. So here I have that little application we were just looking at. Notice there are no JavaScript files in here. So we have an index file, which is our first file. We have a main page. So let's look at the index page. So it says, welcome to our old site. We have a couple buttons. That's the end of our main section. We have jQuery being loaded, and then we have a script. So notice there's no on-page load, or we're not waiting for the document object model to finish here. We're just putting straight JavaScript into the script tag, but we're putting it all the way at the end of the HTML. That way, whatever we have here won't run till the document object model is completely loaded, because it's the last thing that we're loading in here. So we're doing that rather than doing a bunch of extra things. And this is going to change on each of these tutorial pages. So if I look at tutorial 1, well, first let's talk about these. The enter button, if we click that, it goes to that main.html page, which was the picture of the kittens. Okay. But if I click on the tutorial button, it sets the location in my browser to tutorial1.html. Now, when it changes that location, it puts the index page in history. All right. So that page works like we would normally expect. So let's look at tutorial 1. So let's pretend I click this button and I go to tutorial 1. Let's look at the code for that. Tutorial 1 only has a next button. And it calls location.replace tutorial 2. So it takes me to tutorial 2 page, but it replaces it in the history so that the only thing I still have in history is my index page. And we saw that when I clicked on the down arrow of my back button. The index was the only thing that stayed in my history. So I'm replacing that history location as I'm loading this page. And that's what keeps me from having to go back through each page of my tutorial when I hit the back button. Okay. If you look at tutorial 2, the previous button replaces it with tutorial 1, but it's using replace, so it doesn't store it in history. Okay. And then this one is the next button. and it replaces it and takes me to tutorial 3. So all these pages each have a slightly different script at the bottom of them. Here's page 3. Page 3 ultimately takes me to the kitten page because I've completed the tutorial, or it can take me back to tutorial 2, but it's overriding the history. So at any point, if I use the browser's back button, I go all the way back to the main page. One other thing I'm going to point out about this, just because it's a pet peeve of mine, is the navigation on this. This is terrible. When I go to the tutorial and I hit next, and I want to go next again, I should just be able to keep clicking without moving my mouse. But if you notice, next is over here on the left. If you ask me, next should be here to the right of where it's at, so that when I go to the next page, it's right on that spot already. And I don't have to keep moving my mouse back and forth just to say next, next, next. Just a little design consideration. It doesn't really change anything with the functionality of our JavaScript. All right. So let's go back to our PowerPoint here and finish looking at some other things we can do with the history object. So the history object has a length that will tell me how many URLs there exist in the history object. How many pages have we been to? I'd like to say since the browser was open, but you can see with replace, that may not actually be a number. It's just how many URLs are in that history list. There are ways to override it and keep it having a history entry for each page that we've been to. So if I was calling length on each of those index files we just looked at in that little application, it would keep telling me the history length 1, because it never had anything more than the index file, because we kept overriding the history. The history object, we also are able to call history back. That'll take us automatically using code. It will take the user back one step in the URL history. We have the ability to go forward. So when we call .forward, it will go forward one step. We can also say go and tell a position. And that will tell us to go forward or back the specified number of steps in the URL history. And we can also use go by specifying a substring, and it will try to go to the most recent URL in the history that contains that substring. So here's an example. History.back, history.forward. We'll move it. It's just like hitting the forward and back buttons on the browser. History.go and putting in 2 will take us forward 2 items in our history. To have items forward in your history, you have had to have used back at some point. If we want to go backwards, we use a negative number. So history.go -3 would take the application back 3 pages. Or we could do something like this, history.go and put Google, and it'll go back to the first page that contains the word Google. Okay, so that's all we're going to talk about as far as the location object and the history object. Both built into the browser, both great tools to use when you're trying to program navigation, especially like in those tutorial things. That's a great thing to do.